So welcome, and tonight's theme is just a fabulous topic that I am so excited about, and it's called What We've Learned About Women in Leadership During the Pandemic. So this is something that I think is fascinating because, in a sense, although I know that we've lived through such a difficult time, or we are living through such a difficult time, but also it's giving us this amazing opportunity to see how different people have reacted, how different people are leading on a daily basis, and also a chance to look very carefully, to do the research and to see what we can take from this, what we can learn from this. And I think this in particular is extremely exciting. So just before we start, just a quick reminder that you can join us every Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock UK time on Zoom for a presentation and discussion on events and issues all around leadership that I hope will be interesting for you. So we're going to start with a fantastic headline that I came across this week, and it said, "Women are better leaders during a crisis." And by that they meant better leaders than men during a crisis. Jack Zenger and Joseph Folkman published an article in the Harvard Business Review at the end of last year, and entitled exactly that, based on their research earlier in 2020. And it caught my attention, not only because of the boldness of it, but because I feel that this has the potential to change the landscape of women's position in leadership. And also for men and women to learn more about what kind of leadership people want right now, especially in times of crisis. And I think it's fairly true to say that what people want in crisis is probably what they also want in normal times. Maybe they just need less of it. So I think this is a very exciting thing. We're going to step right back in time, first of all, with a quote from a leadership scholar and politician from 1965, John Gardner. And he said, "Leaders have a significant role in creating the state of mind that is the society." So I'm just going to say that again because I haven't written it up. Leaders have a significant role in creating the state of mind that is the society. And I think this is useful just to remind ourselves just how important leaders are. And he said that leaders are symbols of moral unity. We wouldn't really use that kind of language today, but I think we can understand where he's going. He goes on to say that leaders' values hold society together, and that leaders conceive and articulate goals that unite people in the pursuit of objectives worthy of their best efforts. And I think what's exciting about this is that it maybe gives us a fresh approach to see the landscape as it truly is. We can get quite wound up in different aspects of leadership, and I think we need to come back to the basics when we're going to be looking at something as broad as this. So when things go wrong, what happens? So when life is difficult, when we have a crisis, leaders are both blamed, but also looked to almost as heroes. They're looked to in a very intense kind of way. The expectations are high, and of course, the stakes are higher. So with now very high-profile female leaders leading countries and their governments, we have the possibility to analyse this in more detail. We have a possibility to analyse what they're doing differently. And because we have the pandemic, we have measurements. We can see the rates of mortality. We can see very clearly the number of cases. Of course, it is always difficult to compare country with another country. They're not starting at the same point. But when we look across the globe, there are some similarities that are interesting. So what can we learn from female leaders about their leadership approach during the pandemic? So is it really a renaissance for women in leadership? So in this deep crisis, I think it's fair to say that many female political leaders were doing extremely well. But as well as that, women in frontline services, so by that I mean health, education, and all the public services around that, were working extremely hard and were really on the front line of efforts to keep the economy going, to keep people going in all sorts of different ways. Working women with children, I would argue, have suffered the most. They've lost more jobs than men. 54% of job losses have affected women. Women have also been juggling childcare and work and reporting higher levels of stress. Simultaneously, women in leadership positions, whilst also taking on many of those roles in the home, have outperformed male leaders across the board. And I think this is something interesting because quite often we forget that a lot of men and women, they're not just leaders, they're also parents, they're also taking on lots of other different roles. So when we're talking about women juggling work and home care, childcare and homeschooling and whatever their work is, we're also talking about many leaders. So let's keep that also in mind. They're not just in one category. So if we look at the political scene, because that's the scene that has attracted a lot of attention and where we do have the statistics, we can see that female heads of government have been particularly praised. So Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is the obvious one, but also Germany, Taiwan, Norway, Denmark, Finland and Iceland have all done extremely well. One woman that has really attracted my attention is KK Shailaja, the health minister in the southern state of Kerala in India. And she has gained an enormous number of accolades in India, and a little of her story has reached the European press, but I think not enough. So just to put her achievements into context, she has a population of 35 million people in Kerala. They have a GDP per capita of £2,200, and if we compare that with the UK, which has double the population and a GDP per capita of £33,000, we can see that this is going to be that they are not starting from on a level playing field. However, after the first 4 months of COVID, there were only 524 cases of COVID in Kerala. The cases did go up later when they had a lot of migration from other areas of India, but even so, their figures really are impressive. So what did these and other political leaders who were so successful have in common? So the first thing was that they were very quick to react, very agile. They took decisive action to prioritise health. Systems were put in place very quickly, and the stress was on test, trace, isolate, and it was very clearly and transparently communicated. It was clear that health was the priority, and as well as that, it's interesting that KK Shailaja, she says that her success was down to good planning. So there was a plan already in place. This was not a plan that was plucked out of the air. It was already there. It was ready to go. She had already predicted that this could happen. So the backup plan was in place, it was there properly, but on top of all of that, there was a lot of empathy and care, and a lot of these female leaders, we have examples of them speaking directly to the people in their countries and even sometimes directly to the children. I think it was in Finland that the leader there, she did a webinar for the children and invited them and spoke to them very directly about their fears, about the illness, about what COVID was, about how they could keep themselves and other adults safe around them. They spoke clearly with empathy and very transparently with their people. They also showed great empathy in terms of the stress that people were feeling, and they took that on board. But at the same time, they were saying, this is what we're going to do. This is very clear. We're going to follow these instructions, and the message was consistent. So this was this is the analysis that has been done. It's not my analysis, but I think just anecdotally looking, keeping an eye on the newspapers, it seems to me to be a fair resume of what has happened. And I think this is very interesting because for years we've been trying to show women leaders how to be more like male leaders. And yet now we're seeing traits that actually men may want to take note of, because gender differences in leadership appear to be actually favouring women. And they outperform men. And there's a very interesting study, this study by Zenger and Folkman. They assessed 60,000 leaders before the pandemic, in fact. They looked at leaders, both men and women, and they were rated against a series of competencies. I think it was 19 competencies. When the pandemic hit, they decided to repeat the experiment. And I think between April and June of last year, they repeated their questions, they repeated their experiment, and they found that in fact the results had changed, interestingly. Now, on the first measure, women outperformed men already. So this was pre-pandemic. But then on the second round, the women had actually improved. They had outperformed men in more ways, and the rates were much higher. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail, because I think it's really interesting to look at the different categories. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the detail. I just have a journal review of this. I don't have the detail, so I can't comment on their methodology. So I'm going on what they have said here. So they say that the biggest differences between male leaders and female leaders were in the following 4 categories. So this was where women were outperforming men significantly. So when you look at the points, I picked out those where there was about 10% difference between the two. So the first one was taking initiative. So women were taking initiative 10% more. Learning agility. So women were pivoting much more quickly. They were also developing others. And interestingly, valuing diversity, which is probably not that much of a surprise. And then what's also interesting is looking at the smallest differences, because here I think it might be surprising for you. Now, first of all, where men did outperform women, they outperformed women on one indicator, and that indicator was technical or professional expertise. And sorry, just to backtrack and just explain a little bit that this was a 360-degree assessment. So this was not just their employees, this was their colleagues, this was people above them in the hierarchy. So it was a full 360-degree assessment. So in terms of technical or professional expertise, men outperformed. So people said that they had that their rate was better than for the women. But where there was very little difference, women still outperformed, but the difference was 1 or 2%, was in innovation, taking risks, and developing a strategic perspective. So on those competencies, male and female leaders were basically the same. So I think this raises some very, very interesting questions, I think. And when the researchers asked the employees in a little bit more detail why they thought that women leaders were more effective or seen as more effective than male leaders, the answers really fit in with what has been said there. So firstly, they said that women were generally ranked higher for interpersonal skills. They were inspiring and motivating people, and they were communicating powerfully, and they valued collaboration and teamwork. Women showed more empathy and more awareness of people's feelings and more concern for their well-being. And particularly, I imagine that in this time of COVID, that has possibly gone up the ratings or gone up the rankings in terms of importance. Women were more concerned about getting buy-in for their plans. So women are seen as wanting to get more commitment from their team before embarking on something. So they were looking for confidence in their plans, not because they were not feeling confident about what they were suggesting, but they wanted to make sure that people were really on board with what they were about to embark on. And when you're thinking about them pivoting and acting very quickly, taking decisive decisions, you can see that although they were pivoting, although they were changing track and making strategic decisions, they were also taking the time to get their teams on board. So those two things together, I think, are interesting. So this leads on to the question of, well, what do people want from a leader now? And I'm talking about male leaders and female leaders. So I think it's true to say that they want leaders who can be agile, leaders who learn new skills, leaders who emphasize the development of their employees, even in a time of crisis. And that came up quite strongly. They also want honesty and integrity, and I think that comes across in the transparency. And finally, emotional intelligence. This has come up again and again in this study, that people are looking for empathy, sensitivity, understanding of stress and anxiety and frustration, and also an ability to actually be able to help people with those issues. So is it really a gender issue? I often feel that it is quite difficult when we start dividing our population of leaders along the gender line, because there are, of course, lots of other questions. Who exactly were they talking to? We don't really know. We do know that there are many more men in leadership positions, especially at the C-suite level. We know that. So at what level are we talking about? Does that mean that in fact the very, very competent women are not getting to that level, and therefore only the most competent level women are getting to that level? So does that skew that research in some way? I think that's difficult to evaluate, and certainly from the report I have, I can't give you an answer to that. So I think we can say yes and no. Yes, we see that women are outperforming men in their leadership roles in this particular case, but no, it is not all women who are effective, and it's not all men who are not effective. So we need to also take that into account. So these lessons can be applied to everyone, both the women who are not in the 57% who are seen as effective, and the men who are not in the 51% of men who are seen as effective. So for both men and women, there is room for improvement. But what is interesting is that a significant number of women are outperforming men in those particular areas. So I would say that this is really an opportunity for women in leadership to further reflect on their own model of leadership and to value their skills, because what's coming out from this is that those softer skills, and I use that word very carefully because for me I don't actually think they are soft skills, because that gives the impression that they are easy skills. They are not. But those skills of being transparent, of emotional intelligence, of communicating well, they take a lot of courage, in fact, and to me they are anything but easy. But let's value them. I'm not convinced that we are valuing them as much as we could be. Let's not just value them, but let's develop them even further. And many people are on the right track, so this is very encouraging. Many women are on the right track. Many men too are on the right track. So leadership is changing for everybody. So let's take this and really look at those skills that are valued by people, that are valued by the teams, are valued by colleagues, and let's develop those further. Because if these skills are useful in times of crisis, I think we can be fairly sure that they're going to be useful at any time at all. So we're going to move on to our time of discussion in just one moment. Just before we do that, and before I stop the recording button, I would just like to let people know that we have got another 5-day workshop coming up, and this will be in a couple of weeks' time towards the end of March, called Leading with Courage. It's a 5-day masterclass, and it's for senior leaders who want to rethink their leadership and take some time to discover their own inner ceilings and how they can be more courageous leaders. So that's going to be really exciting. There will be more information about that at a later date, in the next few days. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording there so that we can carry on our discussion here in the Zoom. If you have any questions, do let me know. I'd love to answer them. It's a topic I can talk about for a long time, and I love it. So I hope to see you again, and do come and join us next Tuesday evening for another Zoom. Good night.